Hello, I'm Brian Price, author of Crime Writing, How to Write the Science, and in this, the third of my videos, I'll be looking at how to knock people out. After all, most heroes and heroines are knocked out at some point during their literary career, so here are the ways you can do it, or maybe not do it, while still maintaining biological credibility. So let's start with chloroform, an old favourite. Plenty of plots involved a chloroform soaked rag put over someone's face, at which point they're asleep for up to an hour or so. Well, that doesn't work. When chloroform was used as an anaesthetic, you had to keep people exposed for about 5 minutes before they'd be fully under. And once you stopped administering the chloroform, very shortly after, they'd wake up. And the other problem, of course, these days is you can't get hold of it. So I wouldn't worry about chloroform. If you do get hold of it and someone uses it, they might be disoriented for a little while, but they certainly wouldn't be unconscious for any length of time. So what about other traditional anaesthetics? Well, there are plenty of injectable anaesthetics which are used in medicine, things like propofol, ketamine, midazolam and so on. And yes, they can work and they can keep someone under for certainly a lot longer than a sniff of chloroform. But there is a problem there. You have to get the stuff into a vein, and once it's in the vein, you have to inject it, which takes time, and then it has to take its effects, which could be 10 seconds or more depending on the drug involved. And who is going to sit still while somebody creeps up to them, finds a vein, shoves a needle in, presses the plunger and waits for the anaesthetic to have its effect? So the scenario where somebody feels a prick in the back of the neck or in the arm, and they fall asleep almost instantly isn't going to work. So what about the other kind of anaesthetics people use, the anaesthetic gases, things like isoflurane or even the old laughing gas, nitrous oxide? Well, again, they take a while to work. And the problem with anaesthetics is the anaesthetist, who would have spent many years training to do the job, has to fight a constant battle between keeping people asleep and keeping their hearts still beating, which involves the clever use of oxygen, the dose of anaesthetic, and monitoring everything. So the idea of just shoving someone in a room or a container and pumping anaesthetic again into them and hoping they'll stay asleep and stay alive is not really credible. One of the points you might want to bear in mind also is that the idea of putting an anaesthetic gas into a hijacked aircraft or a room full of villains and knocking the villains out while the hostages or whatever are kept safe, that is entirely incredible as well. There are various issues there, one of which is how does the villains get a dose of anaesthetic quickly enough to stop them start killing the hostages, and how do you make sure that you're not poisoning the hostages who may have heart problems or whatever. And certainly the Russian Secret Service found out that this didn't work when they tried to storm a theatre in Moscow which had been taken over by Chechen separatists. They pumped a gas or gaseous form of fentanyl derivative into the air conditioning, hoping it would knock out the villains. Trouble is, it killed most of the hostages, and all the villains were killed with either the gas or with gunfire subsequently. So yeah, it doesn't work. Neither does it pumping it into the back of a taxi, for that matter. So what about a blow on the head, a traditional way of knocking someone out? And yes, certainly that will disorient somebody. They'll be unconscious for a while, depending on how hard they're hit and where they're hit. But that has its dangers. Repeated blows on the head will certainly cause brain damage. Ask any not very successful boxer about that. And you can also look at this quote I've got from an electrodiagnostic technician in the States. I guess that's the sort of guy who does EEGs or maybe MRIs. But you can certainly see that many of the heroes we see in series literature would have been in quite a bad state after being repeatedly knocked out with blows on the head. You see, apart from the fact that if you hit someone too hard, they could get a fatal a fatal hematoma, which is basically blood pooling under the skull and causing damage to the brain. Even if you don't get that, you don't know how long someone's going to be knocked out for. They'll probably come to fairly quickly unless they're actually in a coma. But then they do come to, they're going to be disoriented, they're going to be wobbly, and they're not going to be leaping around, shooting, fighting, driving, and doing all these other things which our heroes are portrayed as doing in literature. So do bear that in mind. It takes a while to recover from a blow on the head, as anybody who's been unfortunate to suffer one will undoubtedly tell you. So what about karate chops and that? I mean, probably remember, if you're old enough, in the 1960s, TV programs and films like Goldfinger had people using karate chops to knock people out. Well, technically it's called a knife hand strike, and yes, it will work if you do it correctly. You can temporarily interrupt the supply of blood to someone's brain and they'll become unconscious for a little while. And of course, if someone's unconscious like that, you then have the opportunity to maybe slip a needle into their veins. Another martial arts type way of rendering people unconscious is the blood choke, where you compress the carotid arteries, stopping the blood going to the brain temporarily, and they become unconscious for a short while. The danger there, two dangers. Firstly, if you keep the blood constricted for too long, they'll suffer brain damage. And secondly, you can occasionally crush what's called the vagus nerve, which runs from the brain down to the heart and elsewhere. And if you do that, you can unintentionally stop someone's heart. So when it comes down to it, how are you going to knock people out credibly? Well, I suppose the reliable method, if the circumstances permit, is the doctored drink. Dropping something like GHB or Rohypnol, that's flunitrazepam, the correct name, in ketamine in someone's drink, will knock them out. It will make them stagger and look as though they're drunk, so you can then escort them out of the bar or the cafe or whatever it is they're imbibing the doctored liquid, and then obviously do what you need to after that. And they can be kept unconscious for quite a while. There have been a number of horrific serial rapes from people putting these drugs in people's drinks and then carting them off, including rapes and murders in London in particular. The other advantage from the villain's point of view is that these drugs tend to wipe out the memory of what's happened. So actually somebody giving evidence as to what's been done to them is very sketchy indeed. Some of them are quite quick to be eliminated from the body as well. So if you're going to do any kind of blood tests or urine tests, they really need to be done quite quickly after exposure. So here are some pointers on knocking people out, which you may find useful in your writing. I hope you will. I hope you'll find the video as a whole useful, and join me in the next one. Thank you for watching.